I was about 14, my dad had read. We lived in the south of England, it's far away from the mountains. So my dad had read somewhere, about these rock climbing courses, very character building. I sent him on one of those, So he sent me on one of these things to North Wales for a week. I absolutely hated it. Just didn't. It didn't. I don't know. It just didn't. It didn't interest me at all. I also think, obviously in those days, to start with, I had like probably everybody, I had quite a bad head for heights. Used to walking on the pavement, so and I had quite a bad head for heights. So I didn't like it at all. So that was that, and then probably I went for about four years, something like that. And then as I was leaving school, I met somebody who done some climbing and said, "Oh, you should come along." And there was probably something up there that said. So I went on that, and again, it didn't really gel. But then, in the south of England, there is a place in the south of England that's south of London in Kent. Very popular place because there's nowhere else to go. It's a very small but vertical ground made of sandstone that's about 30 feet high. And that was like, and I went there, and that was like gymnastics. It was like a gymnastic exercise. It wasn't, kind of directly related to, say, climbing. And so I quite like that. It was small and it was sociable. Lots of people there, and lots of girls, I would imagine, and it was, and so then it sort of developed from there. But I didn't really do a lot. I didn't do a lot of British climbing really while I was at university. I suppose because I was doing other things. I was doing all of athletics at that time, and I probably only went climbing once every 2 months or something like that. But in the summer, for all those 3 years, I went to the Alps. And I really liked that.
I was at what age?
Wait a minute. I suppose 18, 19, 20.
Okay.
Those 3 years. So I went to the Alps. I didn't have much, technical ability in those days because I hadn't done a lot of climbing. But I suppose from doing other sports, I was reasonably fit. So, and then it kind of, I quite like that. Quite like the whole business of being in the mountains. And then it kind of developed from there.
So you were born in which place?
And I was born actually just, what was then outside of London, but now is kind of Greater London area. Yeah. And we didn't live there for very long, and then we moved out. But basically, I spent most of my time up sort of 16, 17 in the south of England.
Right. And what was your father doing?
Father working? Yes.
Business?
No. Yes. Business. No. Yeah. He was an airline pilot.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because he probably wants to know this, but he was kind of, I can't remember, he would have been about 17 when the war broke out. He left school when he was, as he says, it was the war that made him. Because he left school when he was 14 and delivered groceries on a bike or something, and then the war broke out, and maybe he was doing national service, but anyway, joined the RAF, and anybody who could possibly train to fly a plane was co-opted in. I think he started off as a pathfinder, and then became a pilot in the war, and then came out of the war. What do I do? Well, there's only one thing I can do, it's fly planes. So he joined what was then British South American Airways, which was then taken over by BOAC, which became British Airways. So that's really what he did.
And how many brothers, sisters?
I have a sister who when she was about 21, I suppose, went to Australia for a year to work, never came back. Since married an Australian who was French, and lived in Australia until about 8 or 9 years ago, and then they moved back to just north of in France, just north of the Pyrenees. She did some things.
So then the career continued in the Alps. And how many years you went? How did you climb? When did you?
Well, I climbed really. I mean, we're talking now throughout the 70s when it was really difficult to, unless your name was Chris, it was quite difficult to go anywhere further afield than the Alps. It was a far too. I remember once, sometime in the mid-70s, we had this idea of going to South America, and we looked into it, and we just realised that the airfare was just so astronomical, because in those days, the airfare was just so astronomical, we couldn't do it. I did actually, when I was 21, just because of the circumstance I did actually go on a trip to Greenland with a group. That's the first trip I ever did, and I remember, I'd only been to the Alps about 2 times, and I remember saying to this team, well, I'll digress in a minute. I remember saying to this team, well, if I go to Greenland, will I get as much climbing time as I do in the Alps? And they said, oh no, not a chance, because it's an expedition. And I nearly didn't go because of that. And that would have been a really massive mistake, because it's the reason I came on to that was because I went to live in Ireland for 18 months, and every 3 years or something, they used to have like a national, they used to get some government support or something for a national expedition.
Yeah.
And that year it was going to Greenland, led by your friend and mine, Joss Lynham.
Oh, good.
Right. So that's how I came to know Joss. And so I just happened to be there at the year when it was going. So we went to Greenland. But then after that, I climbed in the Alps really for the next 7 years. More than that, really.
They used to drive to Alps and...
Yeah. We used to, well, pretty soon, kind of climbing took over from was long life.
Yes.
So we often drove to the Alps for quite a long time in the summer.
Now, but who are your companions for on this trips? Anybody particular or?
No, it varied. It always changed from year to year, actually. I think probably I was too, young kid, competitive probably. I mean, I'm sure I was at that. So there's a lot of drive there, and I'm sure probably, the people change from year to year. So go with different kind of, I go with the various people really through those woods. So we'd often go from pretty much 12 weeks, like 12 weeks in the summer. You'd spend the whole summer sourcing, at in Chamonix, because that's where everybody's kind of waiting. So did a lot of time there, a few winter trips then, and really a lot of climbing. Scotland, England and stuff, and that was kind of it, because that was the kind of progression then, and people kind of, they became rock climbers. Then they did a bit of winter climbing in Scotland, and then they went to the Alps, and that was kind of it. Nobody kind of deviated off, and very few people went further than us, because it was kind of so really elite kind of.
How used to finance your these trips? Or were you working somewhere?
Yeah, I was working on and off, like a lot of people were. I mean, you couldn't do it nowadays, but in the 70s you could do it. I actually worked as a supply teacher. And that's when.
What is a supply?
Okay, right. That's when you got the permanent staff at school, and one of them is ill for a month, or one of them does something on whatever, and they have to bring somebody in, and they have almost like a list in that area of people, So, and I actually did I did two sort of sessions, which were, I did one in the Lake District, which was almost 6 months, it was almost 2 full term. So it depends on what the syllabus is. So I did that. That was kind of relatively, well, it was on tax, so it was relatively well paid at the time, because they didn't, you just got like paid the full kind of hourly rate. They didn't subtract for what's another something, just kind of actually. So that was actually quite popular in Mexico to people still not actually pay attention in the school, so it's never going to.
So what was your education? I mean, when did you study, and what are the degrees or
right? I went to Oxford to do physics. So I did a physics degree in Oxford, and then I went to Queen's University Belfast to do initially to do an MSc in laser physics, and then to kind of, the idea was kind of to do a PhD. And what actually happened was that I was actually quite happy in Ireland. So it was a bit limited, but that's really where the climbing took off, because it was a very small, kind of quite close-knit, friendly community. And then the whole, I just decided that perhaps that wasn't where I wanted to be, right? So I got a kind of post at a government establishment, which was linked to a university in Britain, Hull University, actually. So I was kind of, I think the idea was to do work with this and kind of try and do a PhD with this university. But unfortunately, it's somewhere, not too far into this, the whole climbing business took over. And that was it, I'm afraid. But that was relatively common, though. As I say, being possibly to do that certainly was. So that's.
So from there, then how was your greater ranges started? Where did you go first, and how did it come about?
I can tell you where I went first. How it came about, I'm not sure. It's that long ago. Well, I've been climbing with Venables for a couple of years, right? And we decided that we wanted to go.
So these Venables because of Oxford, you did him.
Yeah. Although he wasn't, we didn't actually overlap, because he's a few years younger than me. So we kind of met in Chamonix, I think, in about 74 or something like that. And he tried me. But we decided we were going to go somewhere. And at that stage, I think I don't know why we came up with this idea, but we decided we'd go to the Wakhan corridor in the south. And because Stephen and I were kind of, the other 3 people who went were good working sorts of people, quite climbers. And so they decided they would fly out, but we decided we would go out overland and take all of the gear with us. So that's what I did. It was quite a long trip. It was a good 3 months, actually. So we went out overland, took about 30 days or something, and climbed in the Wakhan. Yeah, which I'm always really delighted with now, because it was the year before the Russians.
Yes. So which peak you climbed there in Wakhan, or several peaks?
Yeah, we climbed several peaks. We climbed actually quite near to it's the valley actually that goes down, goes south down to No Shark, and we climbed a number of peaks in that area. Not that many. But they're like 2, I think, by some nice routes. But we have no. It's I always think it's quite hard to comprehend. I often explain that to people. It's hard to comprehend this, and we had no knowledge whatsoever of altitude. No, people didn't. You kind of went to the Alps, and you got a teleferique up to. The teleferique up to the Aiguille du Midi, which is 3,600 meters. And you got out there with a splitting headache, and you thought he must have got some cold or something. And nobody really understood altitude. So we didn't understand it while we were out there, actually. So we had a bit of a difficult time with this tour. So that, but it was a good. Well, it's my first trip, so it was a real cultural experience, especially travelling across, because I'd never been outside Europe. If me saying that, so that was a good culture. It was going to be often. Yeah.
And who are the other climbers? Anybody famous out of that, apart from Venables?
Roger Everett. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Roger, well, I climbed with Roger since about 1972. And I done quite a lot. Well, the big me out to Russia with the big and Britain. And the other two you won't know. One was, well, it's really interesting. One was Roger's girlfriend at the time, and he said he wasn't going to come unless she came with us, and she wasn't. Yeah, but she wasn't particularly climbing. She was ourselves. And so he said, well, I want somebody. He wanted the best of both worlds. So he said, well, when I'm going climbing, I want somebody to keep her company. So they invited a friend along, who again wasn't that much of a climber, and it was really interesting because on the way in, he got quite ill. So whereas we got to base camp with absolutely no knowledge of what we were doing at all, and sort of went, wow, and were shot off all over the place and got into terrible trouble. And he just lay in bed at base camp for about a week and a half, and of course acclimatised brilliant. Yeah. Whereas we didn't have it, and so he didn't really do. He may have done a small peak with them, but towards the end we decided we'd have a go at no shark to need it, and because we didn't know what we were doing, so we all of us did it. Well, the four of us did it, and he was with us, and of course he, when we were all keeling, it was quite embarrassing. When we were all keeling over, and he was like the strongest person. So that was quite an interesting reminder.
So with this climb, you were kind of established in the British mountaineering circles, or the Bacan was quite a rare at that time also.
Yeah, I think.
So after you came back, what was your life to shape? Still working, and any permanent job, or that you never done?
I still hadn't done a permanent job at that stage. No, I didn't. And then the next year, I decided to go to Kishtwar with a guy called Phil Bartlett.
Yes.
And another guy who was English but lived in France, who I happened to know, and a friend of his who was French. So there were four of us, but they didn't stay for that long trip, actually. And then I did that in the summer, and then I went straight across to Nepal with Mek Roger, and we did something in Nepal.
What did you climb in Nepal?
We climbed this really tiny route at a thing called Konde Shah, which is right opposite Namchang. I'd seen a picture of this fantastic kind of spur pillar thing, and I made some inquiries, and it was kind of off limits. Everything was off limits, sort of off limits. And then somebody worked in something, said to me, I understand they're bringing some peaks onto the permitted list now. And it was actually the time when they're introducing those, whatever it was then, 12, 14 so-called trekking routes, and was picking these things at random. So I wrote to, what's his name? Jimmy
Roberts,
yes. Yeah. And, asked about this, and he said, yeah, I can get you a permit for this in the autumn. So so it was just the two of us with one liaison officer who came from Tumjung. That was it, really. So we just walked in there, and I was very well acclimatized, and Roger was just good. And so we just got on with it, And that was you don't want to be too nostalgic about these things, but that was a really great trip.
Yeah.
Because we...
How was Kishtwar then? What did you climb in Kishtwar?
Kishtwar. We went to... We tried to do, again, we were still learning the ropes then. We tried to do Barnage 2 at first, but we weren't we weren't, basically we had a problem that we were delayed a lot getting. First of all, I seem to remember the airlines lost our baggage, so we ended up waiting for like 10 days.
10 days?
Something ridiculous, yeah. I think we flew Afghan Air or whatever. I think we were more than a week certainly in Delhi waiting for this stuff to come, and then something else delayed us. I remember we were in Srinagar for several days, you know, I mean 4 or 5 days.
What was that for? I mean,
yeah.
so you had there no problem. So you were just waiting for your luggage or something?
I can't remember why we were stuck in Srinagar. There was obviously a reason. Something, you know, something wasn't organised. No, Srinagar was lovely, and you know, same time I've been, unfortunately. And then we walked in, and then by this stage we got to the, you know, we got to the position where we'd already used up half our trip, you know, so, and we couldn't get. We couldn't get beyond this village in the main valley. Forget its name now, but it's before you get to Sunchain. And it's the entrance to the Varnaj anyway. And we met this school teacher, I remember, you know, spoke English quite well. And he said, "Oh, you can come and stay in my barn." So that was our base camp, and it's far too low. So, and so we went up, we had this crack at barn. Wasn't very successful. Then we came down, I thought we felt a bit better. And then Phil and I did this peak that was to the south of the Barnard. And then programmed something else. And then everybody went home. Well, I still had quite a bit of time between going to... So I stayed on and went to the valley that's the north of Sunchain and did those 3 peaks that are down the ridge there, and at the time, and then I came out.
But this you were climbing alone?
Yeah.
With the Sherpa? Or?
No, I was climbing alone. No, I just went alone. I went alone for it was about a week's trip. I went up this valley. It's about can't remember now. It's about 2 days work up this valley, and then I got a kind of high, you know, kind of bivouac, you know, and then I probably spent 3 separate days doing these peaks. I can only actually remember one, actually, because it had this really fine granite. It was this kind of rock at the top, you know, it's quite easy to do, and it had this very fine granite kind of ridge. I came down and walked back, and then I walked out, and our, no, I was trying to remember names here now, you know, our liaison officer long since disappeared, you know. I can't even remember who he was, actually wasn't there for very long. But on the way out, I met a guy who had been a liaison officer for another trip, had been further down, you know, towards Kishtram, all your valleys there. And he was a student at St. Stephen's College. He was called Arjun Gupta. And when we got back, you know, he said, "Well, you must come in, stay in my house for a couple of days." And that's where I met Mandip for the first time, before he came to the UK. So that was quite interesting. So, so that would have been 1978.
Okay, so then next.
Yes,
You've got so many things that you have to cover it up all.
I know, it's very difficult, isn't it? Okay, well next I decided I needed some money, and I decided I would, and I got fed up of kind of moving. I probably got fed up of moving around and kind of, you know, living out of cardboard boxes. So I decided, and I'd had a bit of a dabble before that in, you know, kind of guiding instructor, basically for Cream. So, and I'd worked for a couple of people. So I decided, well, you know, it wasn't as bad as I thought, but I'll give this a go for once. So I went to Placid Brennan, and I got a job in Placid Brennan. It was actually John Barry who was running the place there. So I worked in Paso Brennan for almost a year, and during that year, the thing about Paso Brennan then, it was kind of more like a government organised, isn't it? So, in fact, the pay wasn't great, and there wasn't a lot of time off. It was a great life. It was a fantastic life, you know, because I mean, you were just climbing every day, but there wasn't a lot of actual quality time to be able to go on the trips. No. But during that time, a job came up at a particular centre in North Wales that was quite unusual at the time. It worked on a school teaching system. So it had the standard school 13 weeks holiday a year, you know, and break. So, you know, you had your 2 weeks of Christine and then a Sunday. So I applied for that and got that job. And then that enabled me to play. It only enabled me to, from the point of view of point of view of Asia, because of the timing of the trips. It only enabled me to go to the Karakoram because it was, you know, July, August. So I did trips then to places like South America a few times, and once with Edinburgh, and Wilkie, but it was one trip there. So I went to South America a few times, Karakoram a few times. I worked there for about 6 years, I suppose. And I tried to go to places. You know, I used that time for trying to go to interesting places during the various breaks. So, like at Christmas, I'd go to Mount Kenya, something like that in Africa. So then in Easter, we could go to somewhere else, and it was go to because we're now hit the days of far cheaper air flights. So it was easy to go places, and then in the summer I'd have a long trip to South America or Karakoram during that time, and then I got there you see, this will be interesting to you. Then there was a lot of discussion with Venables and Victor and other people that I knew very well. There was a lot of discussion about doing this trip to a place called the East Karakoram and Remo, and I thought, well, this sounds great, you know, it sounds just good, honestly. So I got involved with that, but they wouldn't give me the time off. Yeah, I could. What they wouldn't give me the time off. It was stuck here. I think it was what was the right time? Where did you go? It was
1985.
Yeah, was that July, August, or was that earlier?
July. No, not earlier. June.
June. You see, I couldn't get the time off in June. You know, in Manali beforehand. They'll kind of wave kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that sounded quite a nice idea. So we went there, and I see. Isn't it the same chap who ran the HMI then, with his now president, the White Mess?
Oh, Joan.
Yeah. Was he in Darjeeling as well?
Yeah, he was in Darjeeling.
I think I met him in Darjeeling. Yeah, Doug actually, but in the bloody 80s. Yeah, cut. So yeah, I think it was a Dave connection. Yeah.
So then after 91, then you were to Mongolia.
Yeah.
And how did that come around, and who were your companions?
Well, you're going to spoil my story. But you know the story anyway.
Yeah, but still, I mean, you must record it for posterity.
Oh, I see. Okay. Right. Well, of course, I went on in the late. It starts a few years before that. I went on a trip in the late 1980s to mountain called Shishibangla in Tibet, and on that trip I met two people actually. One was both totally eccentric people actually. One was this chap called John Blashford Snell, was a retired army officer, and the other was Julian Freeman Atwood, and basically Julian kept contact with JBS, and by 92 he was now running this thing called Raleigh International, which does community projects, and there is guys to do all that, and he had obtained permission, or even maybe even asked by the what was then Outer Mongolian government to run a community project in the far west of the country. And while he was doing his research, it's actually a good warm-up. While he was doing his research, he discovered that kind of on the western border there was a little cluster of mountains that contained the highest mountain in Mongolia, but nobody seemed to know anything about. And he thought, well, this would be wonderful. Why can't we kind of explore those? And the Mongolian government seemed to be happy about doing that. So he asked Julian whether he'd be interested. He returned Julian asked me, and it was kind of good at first, because what he appeared to be doing was asking Julian and myself, he was basically giving us a free trip to go and climbing these remote mountains that nobody had ever heard of, miles from anywhere, in a wonderfully exotic place. I mean, what could be better than that, And then he kind of said, well, of course there is a catch, that, you'll have to take in some of these Raleigh students.
Mongolian students?
No, they were British. Basically, they brought in a lot of British, young British people to run these, to work on these particular community projects with the local people in this town, basically this town in Western Mongolia. So we thought about this, and we were obviously very enthusiastic about that time, until he said almost as an afterthought, he said, well, they'll be quite well motivated, and he said most of them are going to be single females in their early 20s. So, we said, oh, my, I suppose we can do this too. So that's how we got in there, really. Yeah. And well, the story continues from that, and as you well know, there. So that's how that came about. Of course, it was very, things of fortune that he changed there a lot, really, because then it was largely independent. It was totally dependent on Soviet aid, and of course, 2 years after the Soviet Union had broken up, all that had disappeared, so the country was kind of desperate financially. So it was certainly interesting for people, but it's picked up on that now. But
So then, which peaks you are attempting, and what are the events on that Mongolian trip?
Okay, we basically we basically went. The three of us who were on basically went in early. So everybody who was kind of organising bits and pieces on this stuff flew out 2 or 3 weeks before the max, the whole student had, the people who were coming. So we actually got everything arranged, went in early, set up a base camp so we could get everything organised and see what was a good place to take these people. But the real reason was because it gave us this week at the start where we could go and do a couple of rhyme chimes before they came in. And then the take-up for this had been so great, actually, and they had to split it into 2 groups. So they brought a group of, so we had a group of like 6. I think that 6 came in, and they were coming in for about 3 weeks. And then another group, they would go out, and another group would come in, and they'd come for a shorter period of time. They would all go out together. And what we negotiated was a week's gap in the middle, where we decided we'd be quite fit by that time, and we'd also seen the range, and we'd be able to pick out the 1 or 2 climbs that we really wanted to do. That's basically the idea. But overall, the thing was quite successful, really, because I think we did something like 23 ascents.
Oh, wow.
Most of those were new. And so, in sort of separate parties. So it's, it's quite different. The place had basically everything, most of the peaks, it's a pretty compact group, most of the peaks had been climbed, but only, like once or, by their kind of straightforward, ridge route or snow slope. So the scope for doing first ascents was massive. Good. Probably still is.
And then what about the accident?
Mm-hmm.
We had the accident there in the year. So what was it and could you describe?
I can. How long have you got?
Whatever you like. No hurry.
I'll do it.
If you want to have rest, we can take a rest in between. Have a cup of tea?
Oh, another cup of tea.
Yeah. You want some?
Okay, yes, we're going to keep the key up. We're going to keep the tea up.
Okay, so we'll hold it now.
We had plenty of liquid and and I remember once thinking, well, maybe if the worst comes to the worst, I can try and crawl down this valley into sort of Chinese zoned area and there's some, adventurous shepherd or something. But when I realised I couldn't actually crawl out of the sleeping bag, I realised that was a waste of time. And I always remember, ignorance is a wonderful thing. And I remember that just before coming out, I read in this medical book, I was swatting up my medical stuff, and I read that something like 75% of people with an untreated compound fracture die in 10 days. So I thought, right, what we need to do. So basically, that's it. I think I if I kept my leg very still, it wasn't too bad. So I kind of just dozed and daydreamed and basically for that period of time. There was one kind of retrospectively quite amusing incident happened during the time, and that was we got into this period of really good weather that started on that night. Weather was fantastic with really warm, clear, which was a outfit. This kind of little stream that was out here was a kind of meltwater stream. It was lean. And of course, after about 2.5 days, it suddenly decided to be, well, like that. I thought, this is going to be really ironic if I drown in it. So I kind of spent the whole of one afternoon kind of with a pan and some spoons and stuff to lean out of the tent and excavating this thing, making dams and then diverting it. And so it flowed off in that direction. It's like, anyway, to cut a long story short, so I'll go on about it a bit more. It's a 4 day. The evening of the 4th day, basically, I suddenly heard this sound of a helicopter, and I thought immediately, well, I'm hallucinating now. I'm hallucinating. It can't be. There's no aviation fuel. But I looked out at the tent and I could see up this valley to the Russian border. And I saw this quite large helicopter coming over the Russian border. And my first thought was, what the hell are the Russians doing? Kind of patrolling this bit of, it's a really remote bit of their border. And I thought, well, it doesn't matter. They need to see me. So I had this big jacket, bright blue jacket. So I got out with one hand. I started waving it furiously, to attract attention. Of course, this thing came straight towards me, and as it got quite near, it banked to the left, and I could see on the side MIA, which is Mongolia International Airport, and I could virtually see the pilot, the space and things. So I mean that it kind of changed your whole life then, because I kind of thought, even if that guy just turns around and flies back, at least somebody knows. Because at that stage, I didn't know anybody knew. So that just changed the whole situation completely. And that's almost what he did, because what he tried to do is he tried to land twice, and the second time, it really did look like, I thought it was going to crash. It really did got taken out of control. And he managed to pull it out, and then he disappeared. And everything went quiet. So, an hour and whatever, I was still quite happy about that. And then after about an hour and a quarter, I saw Ed come over the moraine, carrying a big green stretcher, big kind of on stretcher on his back, and then followed by 2 guys who I I'd never seen before. Well, sorry, one guy had seen before, one guy hadn't seen before. It was basically, I won't go into details now, it was they've got some, and, so, and they were very depressed. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into now, or whether you want to leave it till this afternoon when I do the full works.
No, you do the whole work.
Oh, do the whole works. Okay.
For children and grandchildren.
Okay, right. Okay, so in the interim, what had happened was that Ed and Julian had gone back to their camp, had a bit of a rest for a couple of hours, and then decided that instead of trying to cross this awful glacier, they cut along at the edge, and then they'd climb much higher, but in a direct line over the ridge, over the border ridge that comes down from Woodland. So it's like the South Hills Ridge. They climb over that, drop onto a completely different glacier system, and would get down. And I was expecting it probably to take them 2 days to go back, but because they did this and the conditions are not better, they went right through the night. It was their third night without sleeping, back down to the base camp, and they got that radio to work first going, and they got through to Bashford Snell, and he immediately got the wheels going. So they got these team people organised to come back in, but he then got onto the military in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, and said, can you, we've got this problem, can you assist? And they said, no, we've got no way of doing this, we've got no fuel, we've got no. So, but they said, but there are some civilian helicopters, and we might just try those. So we got onto he got onto the civilian airways, and they of course had a number of big old cargo helicopters that they used flying into the desert, and with pilots, 1 or 2 pilots who've been sitting on the ground for 3 weeks, twitching their thumbs, and you know what flyers are like, they want to fly, and this guy said, I've never flown anywhere near mountains before. Don't know a thing about it. He said, but I'm willing to have a go. He said, I don't have any fuel. If you can get me some fuel, I'll have a go. So then, to cut a long story short, there was a lot of intervention by various governments and embassies. And of course, when there is no fuel left in the country, there is also always some fuel, And they managed to release at some cost enough fuel for this helicopter to fly from Ulaanbaatar, that 1,300 kilometres to the base where the operation, but not any further. So this guy's, it ostensibly wasn't much use, but this guy said, I'll have a go, let's sort it out when we get there. So they flew to there, and then in the meantime, JBS had sort of gone into this main town that they're in and talked to the head honcho, and eventually they found out that hidden in caves in the hillside, they had some emergency aviation fuel. It was the last fuel in Western Mongolia, and this guy released it basically because of all the good work that they'd done in the last kind of 4 weeks or so in that area. So he released this fuel. That wasn't enough for the guy to fly from this town to the mountains and back again. But it would certainly get him there. So he said, well, I have a go. So he took with him a guy who was who'd been seconded by the RAF, who was an RAF pilot, so that seemed probably a useful guy to take. He took with him this chap, he'd been seconded to operate this base at, in this village, and he took a Belgian doctor, and then he took a translator, a guy who was working there who spoke fluent Mongolian. So they took those 3, and they flew into our base camp where Julian and Ed were. They threw off the translator. They picked up Ed, and then the guy said, "I can't fly over the range; it's too high."
A minute, pause it for a minute.
Yeah, of course you can. Oh, have a.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can stop. And then he basically flew down over the range, down onto the Chinese glacier, landed on that, threw these 3 people out, threw the stretcher out, they forgot the medical gear, threw them out, and then just took off. And because there was no communication, nobody knew what was going on. And so these guys were really depressed because they felt that, they knew he only had a chance for one shot, and they hadn't really got enough fuel to, so they thought he'd kind of given it a go, decided he couldn't do it. It was getting night, and in fact, also at the same time, that wonderful 4 days worth of weather was breaking up. It got very dark and threatening, and he kind of just sort of said, "Well, you guys can take care of it. I'm off home," sort of thing. That was their kind of thing. So that's when I saw them came over, and they were of course really depressed by this, and so they got down, and I was kind of quite positive, obviously by this stage, very pleased to see me, and I said, let's work on this. So we dismantled the tent and everything I was in, strapped me into the stretcher, got everything organised, and then of course this big storm broke. It was a big thunderstorm kind of broke, so we had to get the tent out again over our heads. And the thing is that the end, of course, was reasonably well equipped and in an environment that he understood. But these two guys had never been in mountains before, and also they were working, this base was like down in the desert. So this RAF guy had jumped on the plane wearing like a t-shirt and this slack. So I was taking my clothes off, on the stretcher and giving them to this guy who was chattering. So I just thought it was so funny because they'd all come to the conclusion now that, we hadn't got any food or everything like that, and they were probably going to be stuck here for about 2 or 3 days until something happened, And so they were like really miserable, but I was like ecstatic, I was over, I couldn't stop talking, I was over the moon, and I actually said, well, look, I know, I'll bet what's happened. He's flown down to a safe point. He stopped. He switched off the engines. He's waiting for us to get absolutely ready, and then maybe for this weather to clear. And as soon as it's right, he'll come in. So we keep positive. And that's basically what he'd done. But what he'd done was he made this fantastically bold move. He'd flown down the glacier and onto a glacial shelf, landed the helicopter, switched off the engines. And then it's a big helicopter they'd gone round, here in the co-pilot, they'd gone round the whole helicopter and they'd stripped it completely, everything in it, everything imaginable in it, they got out, they put in a big pile, to get it to its minimum weight, they put in a big pile on the moraine, right? But the heaviest things in a cargo helicopter were the big starter batteries that be used for starting the engines. So when it was time to go, he started up the engine, they disconnected the battery, threw it onto the ground. I just praying that he wouldn't stall. He
Fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. And he came in, and that's when we saw him. He came up over the moraine, and of course the RAF guy was out giving it all the hand signals to try and get him in, and this guy wasn't having any of that. It was circled around him. He eventually put it down on a big snow patch and kind of beckoned furiously for us to come, and they picked me up on this stretcher, and there's probably about 150 metres of boulders, actually, there's just bits of bone going all over the place. I think the best thing I could do was just scream my head off, and they got me in. I do remember that we got to the snow patch, and I remember this co-pilot jumping out and landing in this snow patch, disappearing completely, and then kind of swimming towards us with his flip-flops, clenching his teeth. And they got me up there, and Ed, I remember, had the foot end, and because the door's quite a long way from there, and they were trying to get me in, and he was trying to step on the boulder to do it, and they dropped me. So I came down, just crashed, and I let out this just amazing scream, because this RAF guy said to me afterwards, he said, "Lindsay, you do a really good line in screaming." So they just picked me up, all 4 of them now, and just threw me into this helicopter. They all scrambled on board, and I remember it kind of going down the moraine with this with the co-pilot trying to scrambling in and shutting the door, and I remember just lying on the floor then, just like gasping in relief, just kind of still. And then I suddenly realised that I had this Belgian doctor's arms right around me. He was kind of holding tight, and I kind of looked at him, and he was crying, and then I looked down at my feet, and there was Ed, and he was kind of still his hands clenched around my feet, like he wouldn't let go, and he was kind of crying. I looked at this RAF pilot who was so sorted, like there's tears down. So we all just burst into tears, it's absolutely ridiculous, and like 4 grown men, bawling our eyes off. until Ed suddenly realised we were flying completely the wrong direction. And of course, it was only when we landed and picked up all this gear that that we realised sort of what had gone on. And then through some kind of, hand signals and just, I don't remember, the pilot got over to Ed that it was too dark, and B, he didn't have enough fuel to go back out the rain. So he was going to try and get it over the top, and he wanted Ed up front to, negotiate this coal, getting through this coal. So we went up this glacier in the sort of dusk, and then he did a lot of circles, to gain height, and then he got screaming away, and then he kind of slotted it just through this coal, which was great. Ed got quite excited, I remember, at that point, and then flew down. We landed at base camp, it was pretty much in the dark, and they threw Ed out, took on the translator again, and by this time the doctor had got his medical kit, so he'd set me up on the drip and stuff, a few photos of that, and then we flew to this, when we'd driven out over, because I missed half the story, when we'd driven out, it took us 3 days to drive from this, where the operation was, into the mountains. And the first day was quite a long day. We drove to this kind of crumbling yurt-type village, which was the old Kazakh capital of Western Mongolia. And it had a small kind of airstrip and stuff. And he flew it to there, and we landed with just over a minute's worth of fuel left in the tank. And it was the middle of the night, and they discovered that there was a small hospital there, so they got me into this hospital. And because the doctor was really keen now to get inside and clean it all up, to sort of stop the infection as much as possible. He had sort of to do that. And I remember that they didn't seem to have any wards or anything. I remember I got taken into like the hospital manager's office and put on his table, and then he gave me some sort of, this Belgian doctor gave me some sort of local anaesthetic and worked away on it, did quite a big job. And then I remember kind of coming round, and they were saying through the translator, have you got a splint here we can move? And they didn't seem to be getting much response then. And I was getting into my sort of facetious mode by then, and I sort of popped up. I looked around, of course, and there were all these, there was these lovely bookcases and, cupboards and stuff. And I just sort of said, well, there's a lot of wood around here. And this got translated somehow to the office manager. And he kind of jumped up and said, yeah, no problem. He got this cupboard off the wall, started breaking it. So I ended up with all this furniture kind of strapped to my arm. And then we were there. And then I suppose the next stage would have been, the only stage open to us now was to get overland transport from this place back to the base, which was about 10 hours over really rough terrain. And the doctor just was really unhappy about that, because he said, A, I needed better medical kit than he had, and he said, B, that 10 hours would destroy anything that's left of your leg, But they hadn't given up on anything yet, so the next morning they went off on the prowl. And I always think that it's then we had our greatest stroke of luck, actually, because with this kind of, the situation was,
I bet you.
Oh. Yeah, okay. The situation in Western Mongolia, as I said, the situation in Mongolia was very dire economically. And the Kazakhs who inhabit that part of Western Mongolia don't really have any allegiance to the Mongolians. They wanted to get out, And so what had happened was that in the last few months, completely spontaneously, and completely illegally, and about once every 3 weeks or something like that, Kazakhstan had flown this plane into this place and evacuated how many refugees they could get on. And it just so happened that morning they flew this plane in. So the boys were across there like a flash and were negotiating with this pilot. And in the end, basically, there were 5 bottles of vodka changed hand. And we got some fuel, but they couldn't get the helicopter and the plane together, so they had to organise this great posse of people with buckets, and they siphoned this fuel out and into buckets. So they carried it across, they put it in the helicopter, and we shot off. Just me and we shot off to to the main operation centre, which, of course, where we'd flown to. In the meantime, John Rashford Snell had organised with the rescue company, which is a Swiss-based company called SOS International. They had a Learjet on standby in Singapore. They wouldn't take off. It's so expensive to run. They wouldn't take off until they knew that I was in this, back where this base was. And they also had this problem that until that time, no foreign aircraft had ever been allowed into Mongolian airspace. There was a load of paperwork to do. They also couldn't fly there directly. They had to refuel in Beijing. So that was a lot of administrative hassle. They also weren't allowed to do it unless they picked up a Mongolian navigator in Ulaanbaatar. And I remember the Swiss pilot actually telling me that it was just quite laughable because this guy just sat up in the front, and a Learjet's going 600 miles an hour or something, and he's saying, it's down this, no, right there, down this valley. And so because when I arrived, they set that lot in motion, and to cut a long story short, they flew this plane in. They also didn't know whether the runway, it doesn't appear on any aeronautical charts, they didn't know whether the runway would be suitable, but they flew it in. They made an overpass to check it out, and then they landed perfectly. And then I got transported across to this Learjet. And you think that would be the end of the story. No. You would think that would be the end of the story, because what the idea then was, they were going to fly me to this special hospital in Hong Kong. But on the trip out, they learnt that there was this typhoon moving into Hong Kong that was going to close the whole place, for several days, And they realised that if they refuelled because it took so long to do the paperwork and everything in Beijing, it took something like 3 hours or something on the way out. They realised if they stopped in Beijing on the way back, they'd miss that window. So they wouldn't be able to land in Hong Kong, they'd be closed out. So they decided that they would, they had to drop this guy off in Ulaanbaatar, and they decided that they would then they'd overfly China, they'd fly direct to Hong Kong. But they didn't quite know whether they had enough fuel to do that. So the remaining fuel in the helicopter was siphoned out and put into the Learjet. And then we took off. Right. And we landed in Hong Kong. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I remember it was 1 hour before they closed the place. And then a few hours later, I was in hospital. Didn't operate.
My God.
So that's in a very brief. That's very brief. That's all you're getting for the moment.
And then you recovered after years?
It took I suppose I wasn't bad after about 15 months. And in fact, after 15 months or so, or maybe 18 months, I could walk quite well. I was doing a lot of walking. I was probably almost as fit then as I'd ever been in my life, because that's all I was doing. I couldn't climb because when I tried to stand on something, my toes, I just got into incredible pain. I couldn't, and it just seemed to get worse. But anyway, that, in the end, like things do, that kind of walk off. So I suppose it took about 2 years to start climbing. I think in 2 years, I went to the Alps.
And then you were climbing in Alps and local hills. You never went to higher ranges?
Yeah, when did so that was 92, 94 I started, so I was kind of 94, 95 I think I went to the Alps in summer and winter. It was when I was working on one of the books, so it's my goodness, fist care back. Then again. And then 96 I went to South America in the summer, and then to Sikkim. We done in the autumn. And then 97 I went to Western Kokshalatan in Kyrgyzstan. It's quite a good trip. But anything else that year? Apart from Good Ranges, no. 98 I went. 98 I think was the time I went to Janet. Drove out with time in the spring, and then I went to Tibet with June in the autumn. In 99 I went to Tibet, and then for various reasons, for the next 3 years, I went to Alaska. Anyway, before. And then how do I go to another story?
Yes.
No, but then afterwards, as you well know, it was 2003, it's when I got this illness. And that, this kind of undiagnosed illness, and that basically left me with this kind of post-viral fatigue problems. So I wasn't able to do anything at all for about 5 years. And then I remember I started doing some yoga, and then I started bouldering, and I started climbing, and I was actually it was quite reasonable. The walking was the problem. It was like anything aerobic was a problem. So I could climb because climbing's, well, not the way I climb. Climbing is not aerobic, so I could spend quite a long time climbing, multi-pitch climbing stuff, but I had to be quite close to the road. And I just was, and there were lots of other problems as well. I was just slowly improved, but it was a very slow, and I kind of decided that, I was really thankful that I got to where I was, because it was pretty dire for the first 8 years. And then after 7 years, just over 7 years, and, if you sort of talk about that to sort of, some of the biologists, they always give you this knowing look, and there's 7 years, well, that's a crucial period. Suddenly I just started to take off, and it started to improve. The curve from being here started to improve, really dramatically, and of course, once it starts to improve dramatically, if you can only walk for 10 minutes, then to walk for 20 minutes is 100% increase.
Yes.
It's massive. But if you suddenly can walk for an hour, then 100% increase is 2 hours, and then it's 4 hours. Most it really rapidly. So then over the next, that was, I think when I started to do that, it was 2010 when we met. So so the increase has been dramatic. So I've been climbing in the Alps and that sort of stuff. So doing a lot of doing much more kind of climbing than I probably ever did when I was going on trips. So that's been fantastic. But I still have this problem that if I get hit by a viral, a bug and everything, it takes me probably 4 times as long as anybody else to recover. Other kind of things don't seem to matter, but something that's viral, like a flu bug or something like that, and because we had, it's just before I started to get better, which is also not an interesting thing. We had this swine flu in Britain, and I didn't get, particularly bad symptoms, because they say you don't when you're older anyway. But I had the swine flu, but it knocked me out for about 4 months. I couldn't really try and do it.
All this time you've been working now this Mountain Info. It started Mountain Magazine and then went on. But
Mountain Info started, I suppose, with Ken Wilson. In the early days, really. I only really started doing it in 1992. Okay, when Mountain Magazine closed, and Jeff Burfle's bought those rights. They bought that section from Corey. We bought to kind of bail them out, and then included it in High Magazine. So
and after the high closed again, now Mountain Info is now with this.
No, Mountain Info doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. No. It kind of drifted on a little bit, and then it didn't exist. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's not. It's back then it's kind of like the flagship thing, isn't it? Of things. It's not actually very commercial. It's simple, but in this commercial world, people aren't buying magazines either anymore with stuff. So that doesn't serve. It doesn't put it in. I'm still doing that most of the time, but I'd also picked up on the American Alpine Journal, there's 1 or 2 other things.
So American Alpine Journal also, you are now what, assistant editor or editor? Senior editor.
What carefully knows how much of it. I kind of like that. I like that as time goes on, because there's one deadline. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not like this constant thing of having to do this and that. You just have to have everything kind of finished at one period of time, and of course it's great because we're trying to get an accurate. We're still trying to get an accurate record now, and they still seem to want it, which is this, because the thing's been like the Himalayan Journal, but it's been going for American Alpine Journal's been going since 1929.
Yeah, this is where for the
So yes, hopefully,
you go.
you got to keep going.
Okay, and how now the presidency of the Alpine Club?
Oh, it's absolutely desperate. I'm glad I'm saying this. Yeah, it was. To be quite honest, it was a big mistake.
No, not a big mistake. I'm sure you deserve it, and it's overdue. I mean,
Yeah,
with your energy and experience.
I spent 6 months being convinced that I probably had the time to do it, but in fact, it's just been. We've had some really extenuating circumstances, which obviously haven't helped at all. But it's been, it's just far too much work and far too much hassle. And sometimes you think,
Nobody got a full staff and secretaries and whatnot.
no, we only ever had one before who worked part-time. Now we actually do have two, so the whole place is working. But that's only since October. But that was a lot of part of last year that was trying. When I came in, we didn't have a secretary. We didn't have our treasurer was killed. We didn't have this. We didn't have that. People were just dropping. Key people were just dropping like flies. And you know what? Well, I'm kind of presuming it's the same here, but it's got to stage in Britain now where people don't want to do these things anymore.
Yes.
They want the days when even people retired and think, we should put a bit back into. Well, now they're retired and they want to go. They want to go this, there, and the other. They're really active. So it's really quite. And sometimes I was sitting there thinking, you don't want a climber doing this job. You want an ex-company director, somebody who knows, how an organisation worked. There's some things that I'm just thinking this is completely above my head. So it is desperate, but we're there, and I hope we're. Things this year are definitely. I've got a fantastic new secretary now, which is great after a year. Who is Anna Lawford?
Yes,
Bob's son, Bob's daughter.
Yes,
and she's fantastic, really enthusiastic, and I hope she continues that way. So that's good. So things are looking up, and we've got a lot of the kind of administrative side of it sorted. We hadn't. Administrative side was desperate. I mean, one of the first questions I asked when I went in there was, how many female members do we have? And they said, we don't know. Our database is so poor, I can't actually tell you exactly how many members we've got, or even exactly how many things, so we've got all this sort of stuff sorted out. So the whole administration side is looking a lot better, and it's now time to be a bit more pro. We're now being more pro. Last year was largely reactive to things that were getting thrown at us, and we're now be able to get more proactive. And there's a number of things that I had very strong ideas about.
But now anything specially planned for your future of the Alpine Club under you?
Yeah, well, I wanted to. There were a number of things I wanted to do. Obviously, like simple things like I've always felt that the Alpine Club has as an information resource, it is quite great, but it's desperately difficult to access. So we're improving all that. Got a lot of things now being scanned, and digitised and done online, and the rest of it. I wanted to, because I think a club is basically about members and members getting together and mix. So trying to increase the whole mix program that we had enormously, and particularly actually the UK-based meets, which are the starting ground for getting people networking together, so they can go and climb, in the Alps and then further on. So we've got a lot of. That's continuing. A lot of kind of things like that. We're basically trying to improve members' benefits, so we're getting more members involved in the club, which is kind of what clubs are all about.
And you work for the Mount Everest Foundation also, you're the chairman of it.
Yes, I'm still doing. I thought about.
You're still the chairman.
Yeah.
How was that experience? Good. It's working well, and you are helping people.
Yeah, it's fantastic. When I used to be the chairman of the BMC's International Committee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I managed to get that over to Dave actually in the end, and so that was okay. And I thought, I just said to myself, I'm going to have to give up the MF when I start doing this AC stuff, and I'm absolutely planning to do that, and particularly after the first few months. But it was interesting that the MEF is just it's the meeting. But it is a bit of work, but it's fantastic because you go in there, you have a day's meeting. It's fantastic fun. We're talking about climbing. We're giving somebody else's money to all these climbers, and I just felt actually, this is great. I'm going to stick with this. Somehow I'm going to try and fit this in because this is what it's all about. So yeah, I'm still doing that. Hopefully, probably not as well as perhaps I should be. I'd like to try and maintain that with that.
So thank you, Lindsay. Very, very nice life, wonderful.
Welcome.
And what you have done is remarkable.